Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Rent Prep for Landlords. This is episode 258. I am your host, Eric Worrell, and in this episode we're going to be talking about some recent news articles that affect landlords, property managers, real estate investors, specifically relating around criminal activity of tenants and what you can and can't accept as information when you are screening your tenants. There's been some more updates in this area. We're going to get to that right after this.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Welcome to the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. And now your hosts, Stephen White and Eric Worrell.
So I came across a recent news article from newsobserver.com. The author is David Plouffe and Mark Holden, and the title of the article said, "Clear More Criminal Records to Give People a Fresh Start." So this is from April 30th, and to give you just kind of the gist of it, it's talking about North Carolina that leaders are considering legislation that would substantially expand the number of people who are eligible to clear their criminal record and simplify the process for doing so. What they're finding is that in North Carolina, there are nearly 100,000 convictions each year, but there are fewer than 2,000 people who have had a conviction expunged, which means to clear or seal the record. So it can't be used against you, whether you're trying to get housing, a job, or anything between. And one of the interesting things about this article is that it's highlighting kind of a larger trend that we're seeing. I believe I've mentioned this on a previous podcast, but in San Francisco, they're using algorithms, and these developers have put together that will help people identify records that should be expunged and removed from their records, and is automatically wiping those clean, especially around cannabis, where in 2016 it was legalized, and you still have these records of all these people who, maybe they were caught in public with a bag of marijuana, or they were dealing, and some of those are no longer breaking the law. So this algorithm in San Francisco has identified this, and what they found is they went through all these records that used to take hundreds, thousands of hours to go through, and is taking minutes. So they are starting to use these algorithms in other cities. San Fernando, Los Angeles is doing this as well, where they're relying on these algorithms to find records that need to be expunged. And now what we're seeing in North Carolina is that they're actually looking to expand the amount of records that can be expunged. The article doesn't go into real specifics on what type of records it says that they're trying to get removed, but it does kind of go into some details as far as the number of people who have a criminal record. It says that as many as 1/3 of Americans have a criminal record, roughly the same number as those with college degrees, and 1 in 2 has a family member who has been incarcerated. I don't love that stat, because saying 1 in 2 has a family member who has been incarcerated, it's like, I don't know, you're starting to get into Kevin Bacon effect, where you're like, everybody's 7 degrees or 6 degrees of separation. To me, that's kind of just a sensationalized number in some ways. But the fact that 1/3 of Americans have a criminal record is extremely high. It says that researchers estimate that time in prison and felony records drain $87 billion from our annual gross domestic product. So with this knowledge and understanding, what they're trying to do is increase the amount of records that can be expunged in North Carolina. We've been seeing this hop up in states all over the place. I was talking with Steve earlier today, and we were on a newsletter from the NAPBS, the National Association of Professional Background Screening Companies. And we get these updates of when states are trying to put a new initiative forward, whether they're trying to change, the way you're looking at criminal records or tenant rights and things of that nature. And he was saying how, sometimes it used to be like 6 months before you'd even get any kind of mention of any state doing anything. And now that weekly newsletter is coming through, and it's got like 9 states on there, and there's 7 different things that are being discussed and being updated. So right now we are definitely in a time frame, an era where there is a lot of movement happening for social change, social justice, social cause. And what I believe we're going to find is more and more states, more and more cities are going to be moving towards removing criminal data like Seattle has in the past, or trying to change the way that you can use criminal information in your screening process. So to give you another example, a recent article from the Chicago Sun-Times in their editorials was titled, "Don't Punish Landlords to Make Housing Available for Ex-Offenders." So this particular article was highlighting recent changes that have been pushed through in Cook County, which is where Chicago is based out of. And it said that this was approved last Thursday by the county board, which attempts to limit how and when a landlord can ask about somebody's criminal past. So it says that a landlord under the new rules still will be allowed to ask about an applicant's criminal past, but only as a discrete second step in the vetting process. The landlord first will have to complete the rest of the vetting process, such as determining whether the applicant has a sufficient income and acceptable credit rating. So the idea behind this process, and I've seen this pop up in other cities and areas as well, is that the landlord is forced to go through the entire tenant screening process and then get down to their final list of applicants. And then at that point, they can look at criminal activity. So they can run that background check and make sure that there's no criminal activity that would deny this person from being in the rental. So with that said, you're getting pushed back because people don't like change. You don't like things being moved around. But I believe what they're trying to do here is they're trying to make it very easy to identify when discrimination is happening. So it can't just be lumped into the process earlier where somebody can be like, oh yeah, they just failed my criteria. And that could mean, rent to income ratio, smoking, all sorts of different things that don't have anything to do with the criminal activity. They may point to something else, even though really they didn't want that person in because of a specific criminal record. So they're really trying to isolate that part of the tenant screening process and move it to the very end to make it easier to identify when they believe that a landlord or property manager is using discriminatory practices when placing a tenant applicant. Of course, this makes it a little bit more difficult for the landlord to go through the process. It also makes it a little bit harder for the person that does have that record that's going to get denied. Let's say they have a record and it's something that's reasonable for the landlord to consider a reason for not giving them the rental, right? They have a history of domestic violence with, let's say they have arson on their record. That's a pretty good reason not to give somebody a rental, and it'll probably hold up in court. So that person can go through the entire process, and now they're just going to get denied later in the process, where before they may have been denied earlier in the process. So it's something to consider. If you're not familiar, definitely research the laws around the FHA. They did change it in 2016, early April 2016, in their interpretation of criminal records, where they no longer allow you to just have a blanket policy. So you can't just say, I won't accept somebody with a criminal record. You have to make a distinction, a connection, a lot of times called a nexus, between what that criminal record is and why they would not be a suitable tenant for your apartment. So you can't say that somebody, I'm just kind of coming up with something off the top of my head. Let's say hypothetically they got a, for being obnoxious, they're obnoxious at a concert and they got, pulled into the tank or something, the drunk tank. Can you make the connection that they would not be a good tenant? That is different from, like I mentioned earlier, somebody who has been convicted of arson. There's a lot of different things that you can look at and research on this. I will include a link to the official FHA interpretation that came out in April of 2016, so you can read through that. It's about 5-6 pages. It's a fantastic read, and by fantastic I mean pretty boring. But that's also one of the issues that they kind of run into, is they come up with these interpretations, but they're still very loose. Like, I can't tell you specifically what's a yes and what's a no. They kind of leave it vague and tell you, well, you can consider this, but don't consider this. And you might want to think about like the length of time it's been since that conviction happened. But in my opinion, they should either just be telling you, hey, consider it if it's 3 years or newer. If it's over 3 years, throw it out if it's this type of conviction. Instead, they kind of put the emphasis on the landlord to interpret things and come up with their own interpretation, but then say, hey, don't be subconsciously discriminate with your interpretation, which I think is not a great system in the way that it's currently delegated. In some ways, if they were actually more specific, which again would create more regulation and rules, it'd be a little bit easier, because then you wouldn't be left up to interpreting what the rules and guidelines are that kind of have some loose rules and guidelines to them. One of the things that comes up a lot in the Facebook group too is like some people will mention like, oh, the FHA doesn't apply to me. I'm an owner-occupied situation. If you're not familiar with that, it's the fact that FHA applies to almost everybody, but not all types of housing do apply. So I'm taking this from nolo.com, which I found to be a great resource. These are kind of their bullet points of when the FA or when the Fair Housing Act applies. It says that owner-occupied buildings with 4 or fewer units, the FHA generally isn't applicable when a building has 2 to 4 units and the owner lives in one of them. Also, single-family homes rented without a broker. The FHA doesn't apply when a single-family house is sold or rented without a broker, so long as the owner doesn't own more than 3 houses. I'm going to skip ahead on a few. I don't think they're probably as relevant unless you have senior housing, private clubs, or religious organization. But it's important that even if your property is exempt from the FHA because of one of the reasons listed above, you must still comply with the law's ban on issuing discriminatory statements, notices, or advertising. Additional considerations. If the FHA doesn't apply to your property, there may be a local or state fair housing law that does. They give a great example here of one where it says, while the FHA generally doesn't apply to owner-occupied buildings with 4 or fewer units, Massachusetts fair housing law generally applies to all but owner-occupied 2-family houses. So, it's one of those things where every state, every city might have a different ruling on what the FHA does apply to. So that's why it's so important to know your local, state, and city, county laws. And it's a lot to consider, but you got to do that research and figure that out. And one of the last things I wanted to mention on here is just, do the research, take the time to figure out what does apply to you, what doesn't. We'll include some resources to today's podcast in our show notes. But just be aware that things are changing. They're tending to lean towards removing criminal records. And this is most likely just a natural cause of having so many people incarcerated that they're running into issues where it's just like the rates of recidivism, which means like the percentage or the likelihood that somebody would go back to prison. Those rates are pretty high because when somebody gets out of prison and then they can't find a place to live and they can't find a place to work because of their records, it makes it very difficult to not resort back to the same reasons that possibly put you in prison. So what they're trying to do is not punish people who've already been punished in prison, but give them a second chance, give them the opportunity to find housing, to find a place to work. And that's something to be very aware and cognizant of as a landlord, because you're going to see more and more rulings protecting people with criminal records popping up. Whether you like it or not, that is the situation and the climate that we're in currently. So you want to be aware of this and make sure that you're keeping an ear out for what's going on in your local area. All right, guys, until next week, have a great rest of your week, and I look forward to catching up with you next week. Take care.